The defense lawyer, a young man named Kyle, stood up and started presenting his final statements. His voice trembled slightly, and his words seemed less sure than before. Eleanor had completely rattled him. Every time he thought he had gained ground, Eleanor had knocked him back. "We have made our case, Your Honor," Kyle said, his eyes flickering nervously between the judge and Eleanor. "We believe the evidence speaks for itself." Eleanor raised an eyebrow and slowly stepped forward. The moment had arrived. She waited until Kyle sat back down before speaking in a calm, unwavering voice. "Your Honor," she began, her words clear and firm, "you've seen all the evidence. You've heard the arguments. The facts are undeniable. The truth stands before you, and it demands justice." The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even the stenographer paused her typing, captivated by the weight of her words. Judge Carter sat silent for a long moment, his fingers tapping lightly on the table as he considered his next move. He had been backed into a corner, and the weight of the decision on his shoulders was undeniable. He had to rule on this case, but how could he deny what had become so apparent? Eleanor Lawson had outclassed everyone in this courtroom. Finally, he sighed, his voice barely audible as he addressed the court. "After considering all the evidence, and after carefully reflecting on the arguments presented, I am compelled to render my decision." The room held its breath as he continued. "The court finds in favor of the defense. The case is dismissed, and the plaintiff's claims are nullified." A wave of disbelief rippled through the gallery. For a brief moment, no one moved. It was as if time had frozen. Then, like a storm breaking, the courtroom erupted into whispers. The young lawyers who had once dismissed Eleanor now stood in awe. They had witnessed something extraordinary. Eleanor Lawson, the retired grandmother they had laughed at, had just won the case. Judge Carter leaned back in his chair, looking weary but resigned. I did not expect this," he muttered to himself, more to the gallery than to anyone in particular. Eleanor, however, didn't seem to notice the commotion. She stood tall, her eyes focused on the judge. She had done it. She had proven that age didn't define a person's abilities, that experience and wisdom were just as valuable as youth and ambition. Daniel, her assistant, who had been anxiously watching from the back, finally let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He walked up to Eleanor, his face lighting up with admiration. "Ma'am, you did it. You actually did it." Eleanor smiled, her eyes twinkling. "I told you, Daniel. Never underestimate what someone can do when they've been around long enough to know how the game is played." With the final verdict delivered, Eleanor slowly gathered her things and walked out of the courtroom, her posture as strong as ever. She didn't need anyone's applause. She didn't need to say anything more. Her victory spoke for itself. As she stepped out into the bright New York sunlight, Eleanor Lawson knew that she had made history, not just because she had won the case, but because she had shown everyone that the power of experience, wisdom, and determination could never be underestimated. She had won more than just a legal battle. She had claimed her place as a force to be reckoned with, and no one would ever doubt her again. Judge Carter's face reddened as his mind tried to catch up with the reality of the situation. He had built a reputation as a judge who always got his way, who controlled the courtroom with an iron fist. But now, that sane reputation seemed like a distant memory. He had no power here, not anymore. And deep down, he knew it. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on him. He could feel the weight of the gazes bearing down on him, waiting for him to make the next move. The young lawyers, now completely out of their depth, had nothing left to say. They had underestimated Eleanor. They had mocked her, laughed at her. But now, they were witnessing a master at work, a woman who had spent decades perfecting her craft. Finally, Judge Carter sat back down, defeated. He cleared his throat once again, but this time, his voice lacked the authority it once held. I believe we will take a recess. This trial will resume tomorrow." As he sat there, clearly struggling to regain some semblance of control, Eleanor remained standing, her posture as straight and dignified as ever. She had won, and there was nothing anyone could do to take that away from her. The gallery began to stir as the recess was called, but the whispers were different now. No one was talking about how the old lady had no chance against Judge Carter. Instead, they spoke in hushed tones about how she had brought the judge to his knees, how she had proven that age was no obstacle to brilliance. Eleanor Lawson had shown them all that the courtroom was a place where truth, strategy, and determination could win, no matter who you were. As she gathered her things and prepared to leave the courtroom for the day, Eleanor's assistant, Daniel, approached her. His face was full of disbelief, mixed with admiration. "Ma'am, I didn't think it was possible. You've done it. You've completely turned this around." Eleanor smiled softly, her eyes gleaming with quiet satisfaction. "This is just the beginning, Daniel. The real battle isn't won yet, but we've taken the first step. And that's all that matters." As she walked out of the courtroom, the hum of conversation behind her grew louder, but Eleanor didn't pay it any mind. She knew that the real challenge lay ahead. Tomorrow, the final decision would be made. But today, she had proven something far more important. She had shown the world that no one should ever underestimate her. Not ever again. The sun rose the next morning, casting a golden glow over the courtroom as the trial resumed. The atmosphere was thick with anticipation. The once loud and confident murmurs of the courtroom had faded into tense silence, each person waiting to see how this unforgettable case would conclude. All eyes were on the judge's bench, where Judge Carter now sat, looking worn and defeated. Eleanor Lawson stood once again at the center of it all. She had arrived early, as she always did, poised and composed, ready for whatever came her way. She knew the final battle was imminent, but there was no fear in her eyes. The calmness she carried was not just her demeanor, it was her armor. The gallery, packed with young lawyers, reporters, and the curious public, remained silent. Yesterday's laughs and smirks had turned into quiet respect. They had watched her meticulously dismantle every argument and every tactic her opponents had thrown at her. She had outsmarted them at every turn. And now, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Could Eleanor Lawson really win this case? The answer seemed obvious now. Judge Carter adjusted his glasses, and as his eyes swept over the courtroom, he seemed to deflate. His once dominant presence now felt like a shadow, as if the weight of his authority had evaporated overnight. He cleared his throat, trying to find his voice, but it was softer, less assured than before. "Let's proceed," he muttered, his words lacking the firmness they once held. Eleanor stepped forward with confidence, her every movement deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The truth was on her side, and it had already been laid bare for all to see. She was here to finish what she had started, to bring it all to a close. As the defense lawyer, she had presented every shred of evidence in her favor, but she wasn't finished yet. There was one last thing she needed to do: show the judge and the entire courtroom that her opponent's case was built on nothing more than empty promises and lies. "Ma'am, this is a serious accusation," the judge said, his voice barely a whisper, but there was no longer any mockery in his tone. Eleanor stood tall, her eyes unwavering. "I'm not making an accusation, Your Honor. I'm stating a fact. This case has been built on lies, and it's time that everyone knows the truth." The young lawyers in the front row were now sitting completely still, their faces pale. One of them, unable to contain himself any longer, muttered, "We didn't know about this. We didn't know she could do this." Eleanor turned her head slightly, just enough for them to hear her words. "You should have," she said softly. "You should have known that when you underestimate someone, especially someone like me, you end up losing." The court was silent. The tension in the air was so thick that it felt suffocating. No one knew how to respond. No one dared to make a sound. Eleanor Lawson, the woman they had all laughed at, the grandmother they thought was nothing more than a relic of the past, had just put them all in check. And now, it seemed, there was no way out. Judge Carter finally sat back down, his face pale. His authority, once so unshakable, was now nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The tables had turned, and Eleanor Lawson was on the warpath. The courtroom had never felt so tense. The air was thick with anticipation as Eleanor Lawson stood at the center of it all. Judge Carter, now visibly shaken, had no choice but to acknowledge the mountain of evidence she had placed before him. His mind raced, trying to come up with a way to regain control of the situation. He had always been the one in charge, the one who commanded respect. But today, in this moment, it felt as though everything was slipping through his fingers. Eleanor's calm composure contrasted with the chaos that had overtaken the room. As she stood there, watching the judge fumble through the evidence, she knew that the end was near. It was a victory she could taste, but she wasn't about to let up. She knew that in a battle like this, you had to finish strong. You couldn't let your guard down even when the end seemed in sight. The gallery was silent, the courtroom still. The younger lawyers, once so confident in their stance, now exchanged nervous glances. One of them, a young man who had been the loudest in mocking Eleanor just days ago, now sat hunched in his chair, his face pale. He knew that with every word Eleanor spoke, she was slowly unraveling everything they had built. Judge Carter cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. But it was futile. His voice wavered as he addressed the court. I'm afraid we need to take a recess to review the evidence." He stood up quickly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. But Eleanor didn't let him retreat so easily. "Your Honor, I believe we've reviewed enough." Eleanor's voice rang out, steady and unwavering. "You've seen the truth. There's no need for further delays." The judge faltered. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, there was nothing but silence. His once unshakable confidence had crumbled. And now, there was only the painful weight of realization. He had been outwitted by an elderly woman who had been underestimated by everyone in this room. Eleanor's gaze didn't waver as she continued. "You see, Judge Carter, the truth has a way of making itself known, even when you try to bury it. And now, with all the evidence laid bare, I don't think there's any more to discuss. The case is over. Your decision is clear." As the trial continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom became heavier. Judge Carter's face, once so full of smug confidence, was now a mixture of frustration and disbelief. Eleanor had already turned the tables on him twice, and he could sense that if he wasn't careful, he'd be completely outplayed by this elderly woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a distraction. Eleanor, however, remained unfazed. She sat in her chair, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her sharp gaze never leaving the judge. Each moment of silence, every glance that Judge Carter shot her way, only reinforced her resolve. She had come here for a reason. She wasn't about to let anyone stand in her way. "Let's move on," Judge Carter said after a long pause, his voice lacking its usual force. He cleared his throat before continuing. "We'll call for the next witness." He motioned to the door, clearly eager to move the trial along, hoping that a change in direction would shake the calm woman in the beige suit. But Eleanor wasn't so easily swayed. She stood, her voice strong and unwavering as she addressed the court. "Your Honor, before we proceed, I'd like to submit additional evidence." Her words cut through the room, and for the first time, there was a sense of hesitation from the judge. The younger lawyers in the front row exchanged nervous glances. They hadn't seen this coming. No one had. Eleanor didn't wait for permission. With a swift motion, she slid a thick stack of documents onto the table in front of Judge Carter. The weight of the papers seemed to hang in the air, an undeniable reminder of the secrets they held. Judge Carter hesitated, looking at the new evidence. The silence in the room was suffocating. It was as if everyone could feel the change in the air, the shift in power that had now clearly gone in Eleanor's favor. He flipped through the pages, but as he did, his confidence began to crumble. This isn't possible," he muttered under his breath, his voice cracking slightly. Eleanor's evidence was meticulous, every detail carefully thought out, every loophole plugged. The documents revealed a network of manipulation and deceit, all tied back to the very case they were all in the middle of. It was the kind of information that would destroy the credibility of the prosecution. The younger lawyers in the courtroom were now starting to sweat. Eleanor's calm demeanor was beginning to look almost terrifying. They had thought this would be an easy win, that the elderly woman would buckle under the pressure. Instead, she was methodically breaking down their case, piece by piece. One of the young lawyers, clearly rattled, stood up. "Your Honor, this evidence, it's fabricated. It's not admissible." His voice trembled with panic, and his hand shook as he gestured toward the documents. Judge Carter didn't respond right away. His eyes were glued to the papers in front of him, but his mind was elsewhere. He was trying to figure out how he could deny the truth that was now staring him in the face. For a man who prided himself on his ability to control the courtroom, he was now visibly flustered. This wasn't how the trial was supposed to go. Eleanor's voice broke through the tension like a calm breeze. "You don't have to take my word for it, Judge," she said smoothly. "But I assure you, these documents are authentic. I've spent my career ensuring that every detail is accurate. I would suggest that you check the facts before making any decisions." There was an audible gasp from the gallery as the judge's demeanor shifted. He stood up from his chair, pacing slowly behind the bench. He looked over the papers again, his brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor was right. There was no way to deny the truth in front of him. He had made a mistake, a huge one. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. Judge Raymond Carter, usually a man of authority, now looked visibly rattled. His hands fumbled slightly as he reviewed the documents Eleanor had presented, but his mind was working at full speed, trying to come up with a way to regain control of the situation. Eleanor sat quietly, watching him. She had no intention of gloating. There was still too much at stake. Her focus was sharp, and her calm demeanor was the perfect contrast to the growing anxiety of the room. She knew she had the upper hand, but she wasn't going to let it go to her head. This was only the beginning. Judge Carter's voice broke the silence, but it lacked its usual authority. "I need a moment," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His gaze remained on the file in front of him, but his thoughts were clearly elsewhere. He had never been put in this position before, and the reality of being outmaneuvered by someone he had so easily dismissed was something he wasn't ready to accept. The room was silent, save for the occasional rustle of paper. The younger lawyers who had been so eager to watch Eleanor fall apart were now sitting at the edge of their seats, their previous smirks replaced by wide-eyed attention. They had underestimated her, and now they were witnessing the full force of her legal brilliance. Eleanor's mind, however, was already moving ahead. She wasn't waiting for Judge Carter to collect himself. She had done her homework, and now it was time to push forward. She leaned forward slightly, her fingers lightly tapping the edge of her folder, as if to remind the judge that the time for games was over. Judge Carter finally spoke, his voice still carrying the hint of skepticism. "This document, where did you get this information? It doesn't seem right." He was trying to dismiss it, but his voice trembled ever so slightly. His earlier mockery of her had completely vanished. "I've been practicing law for more decades than you've been a judge," Eleanor replied, her tone cool and unwavering. "I've seen every tactic, every strategy. I know when someone is hiding something." The courtroom grew even quieter. The mention of her vast experience sent a ripple of discomfort through the room. She was no longer just an elderly woman in a beige suit. She was a seasoned attorney with a wealth of knowledge and a mind that never stopped working. She was a force to be reckoned with, and now everyone in the room could see it. As the judge sifted through more pages of evidence, Eleanor's mind raced ahead, plotting the next move. She was ready for whatever came next. The only thing that mattered now was winning, and she was determined to do just that. "You really think you can outsmart me, old woman?" Judge Carter said, finally looking up from the files. His words were biting, but there was a hint of uncertainty in his eyes. He was testing her, trying to provoke her into making a mistake. Eleanor's eyes locked onto his with unshakable confidence. "Judge Carter, I don't need to outsmart you. I just need to do what I've always done. Fight for the truth." The young lawyers in the gallery exchanged nervous glances. They had been quick to assume that this was going to be an easy win, but they were starting to see the cracks in that theory. No one had expected this woman, this grandmother, to be a force in the courtroom. And yet, here she was, dismantling everything they had thought they knew about the case. The energy in the courtroom shifted, and for the first time, it seemed like the balance of power had truly shifted. The young lawyers, once so confident, were now second-guessing their assumptions. Eleanor wasn't just holding her own. She was dominating, and they couldn't deny it any longer. "All right," Judge Carter said, his voice now more resigned than before. "Let's continue this, but mark my words, you won't get away with this." Eleanor smiled, but it wasn't a smile of arrogance. It was the calm, steady smile of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice unwavering. As she sat back in her chair, the weight of the moment settled over her. She had already proven her point. She wasn't just here to fight, she was here to win. And if Judge Carter thought he could intimidate her, he had another thing coming. The courtroom was now fully focused on Eleanor. There was no turning back. The battle was far from over, but one thing was clear. This was no longer the case anyone had expected it to be. The courtroom was still, as if time had frozen. Every eye was on Eleanor Lawson, who had just turned the tables on Judge Raymond Carter. The initial shock of her words lingered in the air like an unspoken challenge. Even the stenographer's fingers hovered uncertainly over the keys, unwilling to break the silence. The judge, for the first time in years, was unsure of himself. Eleanor sat calmly at the table, her eyes never leaving Judge Carter's. The soft rustle of papers was the only sound in the room as she flipped through her notes. There was no hint of the nervousness that everyone had expected. No sign of hesitation. She was not the fragile grandmother they had imagined, nor was she the easy target they had thought. She was, in fact, something far more formidable. Judge Carter cleared his throat, but the mockery in his voice was gone. "So," he said slowly, trying to regain his composure, "you think you can win this case, huh? You think you can beat me? Do you even know what you're up against?" Eleanor's expression remained unreadable. She didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a file that she had meticulously prepared. The courtroom watched in silence as she opened it, revealing a set of legal documents that seemed to make Judge Carter uneasy. The young attorneys in the gallery exchanged glances, their earlier smirks now replaced with curiosity. They had heard of Eleanor Lawson before, but hearing about her and seeing her in action were two very different things. She was no ordinary lawyer. Her reputation preceded her, but none of them had ever imagined her to be quite like this. One of the younger lawyers, a man who had once laughed at the idea of an elderly woman trying to stand up to Judge Carter, now felt a cold sweat prickling his skin. He couldn't help but wonder how many cases she had won. How many judges had she stood before? And most importantly, how had she managed to keep such a low profile all these years? Judge Carter's face tightened as he noticed the stack of evidence Eleanor was preparing. "What is this?" he asked, trying to sound dismissive, but there was an edge of uncertainty in his voice. Eleanor didn't respond with words. Instead, she slid a document across the table toward him. It was a detailed legal precedent, one that Judge Carter had likely never even considered. She had done her homework, something he had clearly underestimated. "That," Eleanor said with a calmness that sent a chill through the room, "is the turning point in this case. You missed it, Judge, but I didn't." There was no turning back now. The entire courtroom had been taken aback by her ability to uncover details that even the most seasoned lawyers had overlooked. The younger attorneys were now completely focused on her every move, hanging on to her every word. Some were even taking notes, wondering if they could learn something from the old woman who had just flipped the script in the most unexpected of ways. Judge Carter's face paled. He glanced at the document, his hand hesitating as he reached to pick it up. He didn't want to acknowledge it, didn't want to admit that he was being outmaneuvered by an elderly woman, but there was no denying it. She had just shown him a hole in his case, so large that even he could see it. How did you find this?" he asked, his voice low, trying to regain some semblance of control. "I spent my life studying cases," Eleanor replied simply, still cool and composed. "I've seen patterns, Judge. I've seen the cracks in the system that others ignore. And right now, you've made one of the biggest mistakes of your career. You've underestimated me." The courtroom was silent again, this time for a different reason. No one dared to speak. The tension was so thick that it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. Even the lawyers, who had been so sure of themselves moments earlier, now found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. Eleanor sat back in her chair, watching as Judge Carter flicked through the document. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced by a growing sense of doubt. The entire room could feel the shift in the atmosphere. For the first time in the case, the tables had turned. It wasn't Judge Carter who held the power anymore. It was Eleanor Lawson. And as the realization spread through the courtroom, everyone knew one thing for certain. This case was far from over. In fact, it was just getting started. The gasps in the courtroom echoed through the chambers. Judge Raymond Carter's face twisted in confusion, his earlier amusement gone. Who was this woman? Her calm, steady presence seemed to pierce through the laughter and mockery that had filled the room just moments ago. The weight of her words hung in the air like a dense fog. Eleanor Lawson, who was she? The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what came next. For a moment, Judge Carter said nothing. His eyes, cold and calculating, scanned the woman before him, trying to make sense of the situation. The elderly woman, Eleanor, wasn't the timid, frail figure he had assumed her to be. She wasn't just an old grandmother trying to fight a battle she didn't understand. She was someone much more dangerous, someone who had the courtroom in the palm of her hand without even raising her voice. How could you possibly?" Judge Carter stammered, his usual confidence shaken for the first time in years. Eleanor didn't waste a second. She stood taller, her posture proud, every inch of her demanding attention. The confidence in her voice was undeniable. "I'm not here for your games, Judge," she said, each word sharp and deliberate. "And I'm certainly not here to be belittled by your sarcasm. You may have the power to sit on that bench, but I have the knowledge and the experience to tear your case apart." The room was completely silent now. The once cocky lawyers at the front were no longer smiling. They were sitting on the edge of their seats, their eyes wide as they tried to make sense of the situation. Judge Carter opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He closed it again, swallowing hard. This was something he wasn't prepared for. An elderly woman was taking control of his courtroom, and the realization hit him like a freight train. He was about to lose. "Why don't you just sit down, ma'am?" He tried again, his voice weaker now. "You've made your point." But Eleanor's eyes remained locked on his, unflinching. She was determined. She wasn't going to back down. The room watched in suspense as Eleanor took her seat at the table. Her movements were slow but purposeful, like a predator carefully planning its next move. The young lawyers in the room were stunned. Had they misjudged her? Had they all been underestimating this woman? Eleanor picked up the papers in front of her, flipping through them with practiced ease. "This case is not as clear-cut as you think, Judge. You may have had a few victories, but this—" She paused, her eyes glinting as she looked up at him again. "This is where you make your mistake." The tension in the room was palpable now. The young lawyers were whispering to each other, unsure of what to make of the sudden shift in the atmosphere. One of them glanced nervously at the clock, wondering how much longer this would last. And then, just as everyone thought the situation couldn't get any more dramatic, Eleanor spoke again, this time her voice softer, almost a whisper. "You've underestimated me, Judge, and that will be your downfall." The entire room held its breath. The courtroom buzzed with a hum of laughter as Judge Raymond Carter reclined in his grand leather chair. A smirk danced on his lips as he surveyed the scene before him. The case was ridiculous, or so he thought. The elderly woman standing before him was an anomaly. Dressed in a simple beige suit, with silver hair neatly tied in a bun, she looked like she belonged in a cozy living room, not a courtroom. Judge Carter shook his head in disbelief and snickered, leaning back in his chair as he addressed her with obvious mockery. "Are you lost, ma'am?" he sneered. "This is a court of law, not a knitting club. Did you wander in here looking for your grandkids?" The room erupted in laughter, with the younger lawyers exchanging smirks, and some even struggling to suppress their chuckles. The bailiff, who'd seen it all, had to clear his throat to keep from laughing too. But the elderly woman didn't flinch. She didn't shrink in embarrassment. Instead, she stood there, poised and calm, her sharp eyes never leaving the judge. The room fell into an expectant silence, wondering what she would do next. Judge Carter, clearly enjoying his power, laughed louder. "You think you can defend yourself, old lady? I mean, do you even know how to argue in a courtroom?" For a moment, the woman remained silent, her calm demeanor never faltering. She took a deliberate breath, her fingers adjusting the lapels of her jacket in a slow, controlled motion. Then, with a firm, unshakable voice, she responded, "Your Honor, I strongly advise you to choose your words carefully." A chill swept through the room. The light-hearted atmosphere evaporated. Even the youngest, cockiest lawyers in the front row felt a sudden tension in the air. Judge Carter's forced chuckle died in his throat. His eyes narrowed as he leaned forward slightly, as if trying to understand what was happening. The elderly woman leaned in just a fraction, her voice steady as she spoke again. "Because," she continued, "I've won more cases than you've ever presided over, Judge Carter. And you just made a very big mistake." The courtroom went silent. You could hear a pin drop as gasps echoed through the room. Even the stenographer paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. Every eye was now fixed on the woman. Who was she? What was going on? How could she be so confident? The judge's smirk faltered, replaced by a confused, uneasy expression. This wasn't just some elderly lady. It was something far more dangerous than he could have imagined.